Hello and welcome to a very special week here on Pondering Papaya as we take you behind the scenes of the McLaren team. Each day we're going to be bringing you an interview of someone who's either worked for the team or has a very special connection to it, and they'll give you a fascinating insight into what life at the MTC is like. Today's episode sees us speak to a very special guest. The only child of Bruce McLaren, the team's founder, Amanda McLaren lost her dad when she was very young, but grew up surrounded by motorsport. She told us about her early life being surrounded by some of F1's most famous faces and how James Hunt was the man who made her realize what her dad had done. I hope you enjoy. So I wanted to start pretty much at the start. So you were born in London, but you moved to Surrey, obviously, for where McLaren's based. And I believe your first house was named after your dad's first race. So
when I was
you could
born,
pretty much
we lived
say
in a very small
motorsport
flat
was
in
in your blood
Surbiton,
from
and
the
we
off, wasn't
moved
it? You were
on
surrounded straight
to
away.
a house in Weybridge called the Grey House. And while we were living in the Grey House, Mum and Dad built the house that was called Muriwai, being the beach a little north of Auckland in New Zealand, where Dad had his first race in the little Ulster Austin, which is now part of the McLaren Heritage Collection in Woking. And yeah, I grew up in that house. And of course, that was back in the days, if you had to order something, you made a phone call. And people would always say, where? What? Who? What's that? And so I'm always sort of spelling out the name as a kid. And actually, I always found it a little frustrating. And not really until the light bulb dropped when I was a bit older did I understand the significance of the name and just how important really it was to my father and also my mother. They were planning on having a holiday home at Muriwai after he retired, which of course never happened. But it was certainly a significant place in their lives, and especially my dad's. And so, yeah, they called the family home after it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very sweet story. And I think everyone knows, obviously, about your dad taking his dad's car, giving it a race for the first time, and doing incredibly well. But I was reading from other interviews that it never really dawned on you what your dad did. Like, it was, I think you were about 10 years old, and I believe it was James Hunt, wasn't it?
And I think I've spoken to other
unlocked a memory, sort of made you realise that, oh, my dad did something quite special.
A reasonably famous parent. And they said it was the same for them in that it's just the norm for a young kid growing up. And, you know, when they weren't racing, my mum used to throw dinner parties and, you know, Uncle Graham, Uncle Jackie, Uncle Denny would come to these dinner parties. And to me, they were just uncles because I was brought up in the time when you called everybody Mr. So-and-so or Uncle So-and-so. You never called them by their first name. And so they were just family friends. And it wasn't until I was 10 years old and I'd been to the Grand Prix at Brands Hatch with my mum. And James Hunt was driving for McLaren. And James Hunt was kind of gorgeous. And he was a lot of people's pin-up boy on their bedroom wall, including mine and a lot of my girlfriends at school. And so we go back to school on the Monday morning and we're all doing what did you do at the weekend, and everybody's saying what they did. And I said, well, I went to the British Grand Prix and I met James Hunt. And suddenly there's kind of stunned silence. And if you want to go from zero to hero on the popularity stakes, you tell 10-year-old girls that you've met James Hunt. And so their eyes kind of came out on stalks and they started asking me all these questions. And I drew myself up very proudly and said, James drives for the company that my father founded. And they said, yeah. And then they started asking me all these questions and I had no answers. So I went home and I started looking at the magazines that my mother had, which were Motoring News and Road and Track. And I started looking at the books in her bookshelves, which had the names of these people that I knew as Uncle Denny and Uncle Jack. And then I saw there were books with my father's name on them. And I'm sort of, oh. So I started asking questions at that point and I started reading. And it really was from sort of that point onwards when I started realizing that not everyone's father went racing. And yes, of course, by that point, my father had been killed, but I still sort of didn't really understand that he'd done anything that special until that point. Um, and yeah, the more I talked to people and the more I read and understood, the more I realized just how much he had achieved in the 32 years of his life. And, what a legacy he created. Even back then, I was only 10 years old. James was winning, our second world championship at that point for McLaren. And yeah, it wasn't until that point that the sort of, and really the motor racing bug hit. So yeah, thank you, James.
It must have given you huge pride, wasn't it, after that moment, to sort of realise, like what you said, what your dad did, but also now what the McLaren name means. Like, we're talking obviously 60 odd years ago, and he was at a time when you had these other teams like Cooper and Brabham, but it's McLaren as well as Ferrari. It's McLaren it's lasted this long. Like, that must give you a huge amount of pride.
Well, it does. I mean, I think there's two things. One, for, a relatively young man from New Zealand to travel halfway across the world, be at the time the youngest winner of a Formula One Grand Prix, and then to decide that he's going to form his own Formula One team against the already established greats. Yeah, that was quite something to do and inspire everyone around him to kind of join him on that journey. And then fast forward to today, and we are the second oldest Formula One team in the history, that red Italian F word team. We don't say Ferrari in our house. That's our F word in the family, but it's quite something for McLaren still to be out there racing and for the name to continue on after so long, because all those other ones that you mentioned have unfortunately either completely disappeared or become another team and be bought out and the name changed. So I think it's a huge sense of pride for me, and I am absolutely positive Dad would be incredibly proud. So yeah.
Do you have any idea why it's lasted so long? Like you mentioned, those other teams came and went, but I think reading a lot of the interviews at the time, it seems like he was a guy that people were incredibly loyal to. I mean, I was reading about the days after he died, sadly, and the people still went back to work because they thought that's what he'd want to do. And I think they said something like if he asked them to cross the Sahara, they'd do it. So it sounds like he was someone who really inspired loyalty with the people he worked with.
He definitely did. Yeah, it was Howden Ganley who was sort of one of his early mechanics, a fellow New Zealander, and went on to become a very good family friend. He said, if Bruce said, right, guys, we're going out to the desert and we're going to build a brick wall, they would have just followed him without question. And there was something about his personality. He had this innate leadership ability. And I think he did inspire everybody. They all went into the factory the second day after he'd been killed, despite being told not to, because, yeah, it was what Bruce would have expected. He wanted to build cars and win races. And I think that loyalty and that passion continued on. And when the merger in 1980 with Bruce McLaren Motor Racing and Project 4 happened, I think the name was already well established and recognised. And I think it was a smart move not to change the name. And over the years, as we've grown in terms of Formula One championships and then the road car division, I think the name is now such a recognised brand that we are. To change the name, I think, would be quite foolhardy. But I also think that there would be such a backlash from all the fans. I mean, if we change the colour from sort of papaya to something else, there's a bit of an uproar on social media. So I think the name is here to stay, and I'm just delighted about that. I really am. But I think, yeah, it's kind of the passion behind the brand that kept it going like that.
And how would you describe your dad? Because obviously you were only 4, and sadly when he was killed, but you sort of in a unique position where he's such a famous figure in motorsport. I mean, so many people tell stories about it. Like, what when you think of your dad, what kind of characteristics come to your mind?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't know him. I was only 4 when he was killed. All his sort of achievements on the track and in terms of design and engineering are very well documented, and they're quite well known. What makes me as a daughter most proud, I think, is the way people talk about him and what a genuinely nice person he was. And there was a documentary done a few years ago about him, and the researcher said to me, I've researched a lot of people for films and documentaries, living and dead, and there's always a story about when they got angry, they threw the toys out the cot, they lost the plot. She said, nobody has that story about your father. He was just genuinely nice. And for a daughter, what a fantastic thing to hear about their father, whether they're alive or not. And I do wish for that reason, I'd gotten to know him better. Obviously, I wish he hadn't died, but can't change history. But it would have been nice to just know that side of him, and be able to be sort of more involved with him because of that.
I wanted to touch a little bit on his death. Like you mentioned, sort of is there any mixed feelings for you about the event? Like, were you a bit not annoyed or such, but like you always think of why did he have to do that kind of thing, or do you think that was so in his blood that I think someone said that he was doing what he was loved, unfortunately, when he died. Like, what are your feelings about that day, and what are your memories of that day?
I don't remember that day. I do remember the evening in that my mother and father, after he'd finished testing, they were supposed to be going to dinner with some friends. And I still went to the friend's house, and I was given a doll set. And I can remember thinking, I wonder why I've been given a present when it's not my birthday and it's not Christmas. But I wasn't told what had happened. My mother was of the generation where children were seen and not heard, and children weren't involved in what she called adult activities. And so I was never part of the dinner parties. I was never part of the adult conversations. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't go to the memorial service. So because Dad was so often not at home, I didn't realise consciously that anything was wrong. But I believe I was obviously on some level aware of my mother's trauma, in that she was carrying a child at the time. She lost that. She miscarried, and she lost my father. And a year later, I was diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic, which, as an autoimmune disease in a child, has been linked to grief and trauma. So I was obviously having my own little battle, but I wasn't really consciously aware of it. But my mother, subsequently, when she talked about it with me, and I was much, much older, she said, I lost a year of my life. I was distraught. Things had really changed for her, the lifestyle she'd had. But she said, I went back to motor racing. All my girlfriends were motor racing, wives and girlfriends. I love racing. And your father loved racing, and he died doing what he loved. So she was never bitter about it. I mean, she was obviously very sad, but she never blamed him or the car or racing. And she was McLaren's #1 fan, really, until the day she died, a huge supporter of both the racing team and subsequently of McLaren Automotive and the road cars. Because of Dad's passion for building a road car, she saw the connection. And so I didn't grow up not liking motor racing. I did grow up, and if I'm honest, I still am, more of a four-legged person. I love animals, and I've always ridden. I have a horse, but I still really enjoy watching the McLaren cars on track, and also I've been so fortunate to drive a lot of the McLaren Automotive cars, and they're absolutely fantastic. So yeah, despite what happened to Dad, we were still very much a sort of motor racing supporting family, which may sound strange to some people, but yeah, that's the way it was, and I'm very pleased it was like that.
Yeah, and do you think that helped with the grieving? Because obviously, not just you, but the people around you, like having racing to focus on was probably quite a good not a distraction, but an outlet. Definitely, like saying, okay, I know they raced and won like a week after his death. Like, was that a good? Do you think that was people's way of saying, okay, we're going to agree with it in our own way. We're going to do it by racing and winning.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, people work through grief in very, very different ways. They could have sat around and wrung their hands and said, "Oh, woe is us," and not rebuilt that Can-Am car and given it to Dan to race. But that wouldn't have kind of motivated anybody to do anything and keep going. And I think the fact that they all pulled together, that teamwork, the camaraderie, and getting another car made, and then being successful that year in Can-Am, and then subsequently in Indy, and then the Formula One Championship, I think really just motivated the team to keep going. And Mum called them her boys, and she did until the day she died. You know, Lando and the drivers were her boys. And so I think it gave them an outlet. It gave them something to concentrate on, as well as the grieving. It's obviously still very painful for a lot of them because they talk about it today. And you've got grown men in their 80s, most of them now, and they're brought to tears by talking about that day in 1970. So it's obviously still very painful because I think Bruce had such an effect on them. But it was, I think, having something really concrete and positive to focus on and to do was very healing for most of them, definitely.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to touch on your career because obviously it's quite different for racing. You obviously went into nursing. You went back to New Zealand to study nursing. Then I think you had a little bit of a study in the UK as well. What made you choose to go into the nursing?
It's a really good question, and it's something I've sort of pondered on a lot. With my diabetes, I had a period of being very unstable. My liver would dump its stores of glycogen into my bloodstream. I'd be very, very unwell as a result of that. And I spent a lot of time in hospital. And there was also a program on the UK TV at the time in the 70s called Angels. And it was about a group of student nurses doing the hospital training. And I went to an all-girls school. And when I was about 15, we went to a careers advice day. And I was given a couple of options. For the very bright ones who were going to get 10 O levels and 4 A levels in the STEM subjects, except for engineering, because that wasn't so science and mathematics, really. Engineering wasn't a word I heard until I was sort of about 30. But I hadn't concentrated enough in chemistry and physics. I love them now. I'm really, really interested in physics, especially as a result of my nursing career, and I'll come on to that. But I wasn't going to get the O levels and the A levels to be a doctor or a vet, and I would have loved to have been a vet. And with time again, I probably would have concentrated more, and that would have been my career. They said you could be a teacher, but at that point, even at the age of 15, I wasn't really a child-friendly woman, and I've never been a child-friendly woman. Give me a baby animal, and you'll be lucky if I give it back to you. Give me a baby human, and it's quite unlikely that I'll take it from you in the first place because it senses my kind of level of love for it, and it cries, and I have to give it back. I've just never been maternal, and that's something I've been able to choose not to have a child, and here I am. 10 adopted, 10 step grandchildren, but that wasn't my doing. But so I wasn't going to be a teacher. Policewoman, they said, you could be a policewoman. I thought, I could be paid to ride horses. But then they said, how tall are you? And I said, well, I'm 5'3". And they said, oh, you've got to be, I think it was 5'6". And so that wasn't going to happen at that time to be a policewoman. So that one got canned. So the other option really was to be a nurse. Because back in those days, those were the subjects, those were the careers that girls did. And so I chose nursing. And I started my training at Guy's Hospital in London in 1985. And unfortunately, 2 years into my training, I got kicked by a horse and had a complete knee rupture. The only thing holding the thing together was some skin, and luckily a few blood vessels were still intact, and the whole thing did 180 degrees in every direction on the operating table. And after the surgery to fix it, I got an infection in the joint. The whole thing locked solid. It was horrible. And so I came out to New Zealand with my mum and stepdad, and who were coming out here just on a family holiday, and thought, it's quite nice. So after the 6 weeks holiday, I decided to stay for 6 months, and that became 6 years. And I worked as a veterinary nurse for a little while because I could sit on a stool and log people in as they came in for appointments, and then sit at the surgery table and assist the vet with the spaying and the neutering, which was most of what we did. And then my knee improved to the extent where I decided I was going to go back to human nursing as opposed to veterinary nursing, and I had to retrain completely. And so I went and did what was only at that point the second intake to do the degree in nursing in New Zealand, because hospital-based training was no longer available. But having done the hospital-based training in the UK, I found it very, very easy. As I went through my training, I did a stint in the operating theatres, and I absolutely loved it. And that was my choice once I graduated, to go and work in that environment clinically. And I then did a course to enable me to assist the anaesthetist. And I love the machines and what I called the science of nursing as opposed to the art. And I kind of started travelling down that route, and I became a resuscitation coordinator, teaching people how to use defibrillators and to intubate and do some fairly advanced kind of life-saving procedures and things. And then I got into more sort of the education side of things and started working on advisory panels, national resuscitation panels and nursing professional panels across New Zealand. Did a Masters of Nursing. And then I was still working as a nurse in New Zealand when we got the call from McLaren Automotive offering myself and my husband roles with them back in the UK. And so at that point, we decided we would take up those offers. And after 3 years, you lose your practicing certificate if you haven't been practicing as a nurse, just because you haven't done the hours and done the professional development. So although I am still a registered nurse, I can no longer practice unless I went back to do a return to nursing course. But now I'm sort of officially retired, although busier than I ever was. That was sort of my nursing career. And I think, people ask me if Dad hadn't died, would I have worked for McLaren, or what I would have done, or had I been a boy? And I certainly think if I'd been a boy and the opportunity was available through my schooling, some sort of mechanical engineering. I love putting things together. I loved orthopedic surgery, which is kind of carpentry and meccano for clever adults. And I think that's possibly the career I would have taken, but I don't know. So.
Yeah, when you were talking, I mean, I definitely got the similar hint. Like, I could see a lot of your dad's traits when you were saying how you seem to have a massive interest in how things work. Like you were saying about the anaesthetist and stuff like that. You could definitely. Do you think you got that from your dad? Because obviously he loves working out how things worked as well.
I think I probably did. I mean, there's the whole nature-nurture debate as to sort of what influences children. But I certainly think, how things work, putting things together, how things move from A to B through sort of pipes and pressure, and I find all that sort of thing fascinating. So I think I probably did get that from my dad, although my mum kind of had a little bit of that as well. So I think probably I got double whammy.
But you couldn't escape it.
And it's certainly something that still fascinates me today. And cars today, especially Grand Prix cars and high performance road cars, are computers on wheels, and my understanding of IT is very basic. But when my first car was a VW Beetle, and I kind of, even though you couldn't get to the engine and the spark plugs because they were buried deep within its bottom, but I then had a Mini later on, and I actually kind of really could understand the workings of that car, and I loved that. Now that little engine works and the little pistons go up and down, and today it's quite different. I haven't a clue. But I think I definitely inherited that from Dad and possibly Mum as well. So yeah.
You were doing your nursing career, so obviously you were very, very busy. What was your relationship with the team like at the time? Because you returned in 2014, but what was that gap like? Did you have any contact with them? Were you keeping an eye out for their results, or was it you're just so busy, you focused on your own life that it sort of fades into the background?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, when I was in England, I always followed them very closely. When I first came over to New Zealand, we didn't have Sky TV over here, and Formula One wasn't on the TV. So I'd kind of catch up a couple of days later in the newspaper, and it wasn't the same thing. So I really kind of lost contact for a little while. And then, and I saw it in the newspaper that McLaren had formed a automotive company and were going to build something called the MP412C, which was a huge mouthful. I'm thinking, what on earth? And even when I discovered why they named it that, it was still mind-bogglingly sort of complicated, and just the 12C name is much better. But I learnt all about that through the newspapers, and it wasn't my husband and I. We go back to the UK on holiday, sort of usually about every other year. My husband's very much into his cars and his racing as well. And we'd always go back around the time of the British Grand Prix and the Goodwood Festival of Speed. And so we'd gone back, and it was 2013, and it was the first time McLaren Automotive had a proper stand at the Goodwood Festival of Speed. But up until that, whenever I'd been back in the UK, or subsequently my husband and I had been back in the UK, we'd always gone back to MTC as guests of racing. And even at that time at Goodwood, we were guests of racing, but we went across to meet the people at Automotive. But when Automotive was first formed, it was very much ring-fenced in terms of being a separate company and completely separate funding and financing, in that if it didn't work, it wasn't going to affect the Formula One team. And it was quite funny because when I first started working at McLaren Automotive, my then boss, who wasn't the CEO, it wasn't Mike Blurt, but my then boss actually said to me, "You're not allowed to talk to anyone at racing, and you're not allowed to talk about racing." And when I was interviewed, it made things really, really awkward because, of course, people would ask me. And it was quite difficult for a little while. And, of course, all our friends at racing, who I'd known kind of socially prior to that, from meeting them at various things, would say, "Hi, Amanda," and I'm like, "Never get into trouble," which I think people afterwards was a bit hysterical, but I was trying to kind of, because it was an interesting one. I was there, my husband and I were there because we were Bruce's daughter and son-in-law. But I also said to them, I don't expect to be treated any differently. Now, they did, bless their cotton socks. Some of them were just absolutely lovely, and the head of security on my little security pass had the little picture of me in my dad's M6 GT when I was 4 years old. Yeah, everyone else got their picture taken, their kind of passport photo picture. I had that, and I had an all-access swipe on my, which again the head of HR at the time was not best pleased about. But they looked after me like that, which was fantastic. But I still kind of had to be a bit careful and not tread on too many toes. And I hate people who sort of say, "Don't you know who I am?" and use that as a way to get something or get somewhere. And I don't do that. And so a lot of doors have been open for me over the years, but they've been open for me. I don't tend to ask for people to open them. And so that was quite interesting for a little while, but it did mean we're in the UK and we've got Sky TV and we can actually watch the races. And we did go to some and really get engaged back with it. The downside was, at that point, the team was actually not doing particularly well, and it was really kind of gut-wrenching. So at least we had, one of, to me, debatable, the second best supercar on the planet, F1 being the first one, P1 being the second. I mean, that car, F1 broke ground, rewrote the rule book, P1 did the same thing. And so McLaren was doing really well in terms of road car, so it wasn't all doom and gloom. And then things changed, and we our job description changed slightly, and we were allowed to kind of embrace racing a little more. And the walls started coming down between the two companies, especially because automotive was doing so well, and certainly made our jobs easier. And then the pandemic happened, and we were furloughed. We're sitting at home. Under the Animal Welfare Act, I was allowed to go out and ride my horse. So I spent lockdown in 2020 riding my horse across Topham Common. My husband's at home looking at the walls, doing his family tree on the computer. And we're thinking, when's this going to end? What are we going to do? And he was really missing his grandchildren. He hadn't seen the youngest. There was another young one on the way. And so we decided at that point we would retire, in that my stepfather had died. He was our last reason to stay in the UK apart from our jobs, and not knowing what our jobs were going to hold in the future, if and when we'd be able to go back to them. We made the decision to come back to New Zealand. We've since, and we get Sky TV here now, thank goodness. We can watch the races and the Indy Series and the Formula E and everything else that goes on. And we've been guests of McLaren at various things over the last couple of years since we've been back here, especially last year with the 60th anniversary of the race team. And so we can now kind of pick and choose what we do, which is lovely. But we're as I said before, we're still very busy in terms of doing that and supporting the team, and also now running the Bruce McLaren Trust, which has taken up a huge amount of our time as well. So, yeah.
I wanted to touch on the Bruce McLaren Trust as a great segue. If you could sort of explain why it was started, the goals behind it, because I think it's a really interesting one, especially with the New Zealand link. Like, if you want to just have a quick explanation of why the trust was set up, and also your role today, how you were involved.
Okay, well, the trust was actually set up by my aunt back in the late 90s, and she had some help from some very good friends of kind of mum and dad's, prominent New Zealanders who had that link with motor racing. And the original aims and objectives were to sort of perpetuate the legacy of my father. And over the time that the trust kind of grew, and I was a trustee for a short time during that period. But I have to say, some of the aims and objectives and what was going on didn't sit quietly with me. And I actually resigned as a trustee, and it was just at the time that I was going to the UK. And I really just didn't want to try to be a trustee from the UK and be involved with what was going on over here. So we kind of stepped away from that. And then towards the end of sort of the late 2017, 18, 19, the trust kind of became a wee bit dormant. And then during the pandemic, obviously nothing happened. My husband and I came back to New Zealand at the end of 2021, and we had to go something called MIQ, which was managed something quarantine. We sat in a hotel room for 2 weeks in quarantine, sort of twiddling our thumbs. And I'm like, I'm going to write a proposal to the trustees because some of them have been talking about kind of retiring or handing over the trust, or me finding some new trustees. So I wrote a proposal with a whole new set of aims and objectives and what we would do. And I have to say, I was actually quite surprised when they agreed that they would step down and hand over to myself, and at that point 2 others, and subsequently now my husband's come on board as well. But we've changed the aims and objectives slightly, in that it become really a sort of repository for all things New Zealand motor racing, and also there was things about rallying and bikes, and it had become very much a sort of New Zealand sort of collector and curator of everything on wheels. And so we've pared it right back to just about Dad and Denny Holm, Howden Ganley, and Chris Amon, really the people that he worked very closely with at that time, who were also New Zealanders. And we have set up 2 scholarships, or he didn't actually set them up, but we're still working on one. So one is for an engineering scholar to go to McLaren Automotive, and that was in existence before we took over as trustees. But what we've said is the trust would pay for that; they would sponsor it. In the meantime, Racing saw what was happening with the scholar from the Auckland University and how beneficial it had been, and they offered a similar scholarship. So there's now 2, and the trust is supporting both of them, and we're paying for half, and the New Zealand UK Link Foundation is paying the other half. What we've also said is that we will sponsor a young driver and do a scholarship for them. We are not sure who or what or how that's going to look like. We're working on that at the moment, but we will give some money to a young New Zealand driver to do something to help their career. And the reason we decided to do that was, Dad formed his career on the basis of winning that Driver to Europe scholarship. So we can't fund somebody to Europe to race in a Formula One team. That doesn't quite happen anymore. But giving them some sort of help. And that one of the things we're doing. The other thing we said we would do, which has been a huge piece of work, and my husband's done 90% of it, is to itemise, photograph and catalogue every item in our collection, which is huge. And I've added a huge amount more to it in that everything I had, I've donated to the trust. And so there's a lot of new items that we've put in there. They were on display at Hampton Downs, which is one of the new tracks in New Zealand, and the trust had bought one of the industrial units there. And it's a nice big space, but it's not temperature controlled or humidity controlled, and it's not really the ideal place to display items on an ongoing basis in terms of preservation. So we've been working very closely with the museum director, and we were also offered the space on the ground floor of what is the original garage where Dad was brought up, where he met Jack Brabham, where he worked on that little Ulster, where he and Pop, my grandfather, his father, used to work on all the cars, and where he started his racing career. And that's been bought by a third party. It's in private ownership, but they have offered the trust the ground floor. So because New Zealand's on the San Andreas Fault, or the continuation of it down through the Pacific Rim, everything has to be seismically strengthened before we can turn it into sort of a public building. And I say we, the owner, but the trust can't do what it wants to do until all that work's been done. But we are working very closely with the owner, who's managing that side of things. So it's going to be quite exciting when we do move in there. There's also a lot of exciting work going on with Auckland University, and unfortunately I'm not allowed to talk about that because it's embargoed at the moment. But again, just more things to kind of preserve the legacy, and also make the links with today and the current McLaren team and automotive, and lots of exciting things.
I mean, that's hugely exciting. Yeah, I imagine it'd be very cool to see all that memorabilia. Is there a particular item that you're particularly fond of? Is there something you've always kept of your dad's that's sort of your memory of him?
Good question. I think one of the things I'm very proud that he got was the Seagrove Trophy, for his contribution to technology in land, sea, and air, and to beat everybody else and to be awarded that. And the big statue is on display at the RAC rooms in London. It stays there. It's a perpetual thing. But Mum was given a plaque, which she then bequeathed to me, and that's now at the trust. And I think that's just something, because it wasn't just for sort of racing, it was for engineering and people that, were in different fields of sort of transport could win it as well. So for Dad to win that, I think was really something quite special. I have a few very precious items. A letter from him to my mother that she kept in her wallet, and I found when I went through it after she died, which, that will eventually go to the trust, but I'm going to keep that with me until I die. And then, written instructions as to where all these things are to go, and hopefully the trust is still going at that point. We need some, fresh young trustees to keep it going into the future. But I think we're in a very strong position, and having those links back with McLaren again, and they've officially endorsed us. We're allowed to use the swoosh logo on our letterhead and on our business cards and in our printed media and on social media. And Zach Brown agreed to be our patron. And so that just again sort of firms up those links with the past and the present. And part of our role and my role in social media with the trust is to make people realise where the name McLaren came from, because they don't know. Everyone knows where the F word came from, in terms of their racing team, and people understand Red Bull because all the kids drink the drink. But people do say, well, where does the name McLaren come from? So, little kid from New Zealand. So again, with Zach and Automotive, they're putting the Kiwi on the car. And they're promoting on their social media, 3 days ago, anniversary of June 2nd, 2 days ago for the UK. McLaren Automotive and Racing, their social media was all about Dad, which is just lovely. It's really come full circle, and they're making a lot out of the history and the heritage, which makes me hugely proud and makes my job as a trustee of the trust easier too. But I do most of the social media. So.
Yeah, I guess my final question would be: if your dad was alive today, what do you think he'd make of the team? Because obviously it's huge, it's massive, it's one of the biggest car brands in the world, it's one of the biggest F1 brands in the world. Could you think he could have imagined how big it's become?
It's an interesting question. Howden Ganley, when he's interviewed and asked that question, said Bruce was building an empire. So he obviously had think big plans. They were in Formula 1, Formula 2, Formula 5000 or Formula Libre, depending where you live. They were building sports cars. He had the Group 7 Can-Am cars. He was planning on Group 4 cars for Le Mans and the homologated road cars. I think he'd look at the technology of the cars today and think, wow, but he'd love it. He experimented with malite from the aerospace industry in terms of a much lighter material to build the cars with, but stiffer and structurally better for a race car. So he'd get the carbon fibre and the composites and the things they're using today. He'd certainly, I think, be intrigued by the fact that you no longer had a clutch and something to change gears with. He just kind of relied on the electronics, and it's all quite amazing. But I think he would be so proud. And that's why I'm still so passionate about the brand and what it is they're doing and the passion with which they do it. And the fact that you now go into the McLaren Technology Centre and there are pictures of Dad up on the wall in the race bays and in their design studios. And they still kind of carry that fire and that enthusiasm. And I think that harks back to a previous question about why they kept going and why they're second only to Ferrari, which has just got such a huge history and go back so much further. But I think Dad would just be hugely honoured and proud that his name does carry on. And yeah, he'd walk around the McLaren Technology Centre, but then he's right. Yeah, I want to go drive one of these cars and see what you guys are. But I think, and again, I talk about the road cars. You look at the design philosophy and you look at Dad's road car. It's exactly the same. Yeah, just with today's materials and abilities. But the basics don't change. You want a car to pierce the air and go through quickly. You don't build a brick. You build something with a pointy nose that's going to split the air, and then you deal with the air as it goes over. And Dad got that sorted. He did nostrils, he did wings. P1 used the same nostrils. He'd look at the car and he'd think, "Oh, I recognise those off one of my own race cars." He'd love it. He really would love it.
I mean, a huge thanks once again. That's been an absolutely fascinating chat for me, and I'm sure for our listeners. So thanks again, Amanda, for giving up a portion of your evening to have a chat with us.
Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
My thanks to Amanda once again for telling me just what it's like to be a McLaren. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode, but in the meantime, you can follow us on socials at Pondering Papaya, and make sure you subscribe as well and give us a rating while you're there. We'll see you again soon.